Good afternoon, I'm a modern warfare historian and today we will continue our Warfare Room Operation series. Last time we discussed on Japanese Operation Mo, the planned sea invasion of Port Moresby and how it was stopped at the Battle of Coral Sea. Today we will take a look at the Japanese reaction to the strategic naval defeat with the start of the Kokoda truck campaign. Now, let's get started. Before starting the ground attack towards Port Moresby, we will have to briefly understand Japanese planning at this stage of the war. While the Allied forces at this time of the war were fighting by Tokyo's advance, the Japanese were actually uncertain towards the future. It is commonly understood that there was a big distance between the Navy and the Army, and this reflects towards strategic planning as well. Both had a multi-phase ground campaign in mind. The army had two distinct phases. Phase 1 was to invade with around 400,000 troops all the main objectives in the south, in order to create a fortress that would prove too costly to break in. Phase 2 was to be completed by spring 1942, and it would be a removal of around half of the troops in order to send them back to the border with the Soviet Union. This is because the Japanese were always fearful, after the defeat at Khalkhin Gol, of Moscow's possible invasion. Major General Tanaka Sanichi wrote in his diary that preparation for operations against the Soviet Union would be completed by the spring of 1942. From what I've seen on this subject, it is not clear what type of operations the Japanese were planning. Probably there are two options. First one would be a Japanese strike towards Lake Baikal, and that's basically the Hokushin-Ron, the Japanese Northern Strike. Second option will just be a simple build-up of forces in order to discourage Soviet aggression. My personal take is that Tokyo will go on with option 2, and the reason being time and resources. It is early 1942, Japanese forces are fighting in China and in the south, and the invasion of Soviet Union will require millions of troops, and the Japanese do not have them available for basically a third front. Another reason is the German invasion of Soviet Union. Again, it is early 1942, therefore Operation Barbarossa has been stopped, the Russians have made their winter offensive, and for Blau, the German 1942 offensive towards the oil field in the Caucasus will not start before late June. So, to an outsider eye, it may seem that the German offensive have reached a stalemate, and if you really want to open up a third front, I guess you would want a quick victory against an enemy that is being defeated by your ally. The Army General Staff started to prepare for their Phase 2, as almost all of their main objectives have been taken. One of the remaining ones is, you guessed it, Port Moresby, and this explains the Japanese multiple offensives towards it. The Navy was more of a mess. The brain of the Imperial Japanese Navy was divided on what type of operation to take. The Navy General Staff preferred a long-term solution, aimed to attack Australia by interfering with her supply lines and, while doing so, create a chain of fortresses in order to resist to any possible counter-offensive. The combined fleet, however, wanted a quick decisive victory against the American fleet in places like Midway and Hawaii, following the Kentai-Kessen doctrine. However, none of the two had a detailed plan in the pre-war period, as Phase 2 would be envisioned and planned after seeing how the war was progressing. After the defeat in Operation Mo, the Japanese were starting to look at what route they could take in order to conquer Port Moresby, and therefore enable themselves to dig up their position and send reinforcements north to fight against China. The only land route possible was the small mountain track that connected Buna to Port Moresby, passing by Kokoda. The Japanese would have a very small problem, however, logistics, that made the plan very risky. Commander Hori of the South Sea Forces noted that the South Sea Forces will identify the best route from Buna to Kokoda to Port Moresby. From Buna to Kokoda is approximately 100 kilometers as the crow flies, but is in fact around 160 kilometers. Likewise, Kokoda to Port Moresby is 120 kilometers direct, but is judged to be around 200 kilometers actual distance. In short, this route requires over 360 kilometers of trudging. The problem is securing supplies. This will not be an issue if there was a road suitable for motor transport. However, without so much as a park horse trail all supplies will need to be transported by human carriers. The current number of men on the front line would be approximately 5,000. Given an average daily food requirement of 600 grams per person, this will result in a daily supply requirement for the detachment amounting to 3 tons. If each man could carry 25 kilograms of supplies, this would limit a day's march in the mountains to 20 kilometers. A round-trip march to the front line will take 20 days, if the detachment were to advance to the saddle of the Owen Stanley Range, approximately 100 kilometers from Buna. Given that supplies for each soldier would be depleted by 12 kilograms after 20 days, the amount he could deliver to the front line would be 13 kilograms. Securing the daily 3-ton supply for the detachment will require approximately 230 carriers per day, reaching the front line. This amount in total, given the 20-day round trip, to a requirement of approximately 4,600 carriers. If the front were to advance to Port Moresby, some 360 kilometers distant from Buna, then to supply food alone will require 32,000 carriers. If one considers munition and other supplies, the requirement for carriers would be immense. Ultimately, the overland route is probably not possible unless a road for motor transport can be pushed out from Buna. These logistical problems also heavily limited the fighting capacity of the troops. Because each kilogram mattered, the troops had a limited amount of ammunition, and it is understandable as a soldier without ammunition is a semi-useless soldier, while a soldier without food is a dead one. To understand how bad the situation, a mountain artillery company that usually has 4 Type 94 75mm mountain gun had just one gun with only 200 rounds of ammunition carried by individual soldiers in the backpacks, as each shell weighed between 6 and 7 kilograms, depending on the type of ammunition. To help these supplies, 500 volunteers from Taiwan and Korea were dispatched to the area, and around 2,000 natives were recruited by force. But, as we will see, the supply situation will still be bad. This invasion was quite big, therefore I decided to not create a chart explaining all of the organization, as I will just keep note of the main forces. However, if you're interested, check the links in the description for the main source of this video, the book called Japanese Army Operation in the South Pacific Area. The land forces were part of the South Seas Forces and were composed of the 144th Infantry Regiment, 55th Mountain Artillery Battalion, 15th Independent Engineer Regiment at parts rank, 1 company and 1 platoon of the 10th Independent Engineer Regiment. The landing started on July 21st at 5:30 p.m. Japanese forces were only opposed by Allied B-17 and B-26 bombers, as a small Australian forces that was nearby withdrew without engaging. The Japanese transport Hayato-san Maru was sunk, and the destroyer Uzuki was damaged slightly. In the following days, the ships in the bay were under American and Australian bombs, and the transport Kotoku Maru was damaged on the 29th, but it had already landed its troops safely ashore. The ship sank while it was returning to Rabaul. Around 1,800 Japanese soldiers landed on the initial assault, and in the following hours, total Japanese numbers reached around 3,000 units. The Japanese fleet retreated back to Rabaul on the 31st. The Australians had in the area only B Company of the 39th Battalion and the Papuan Infantry Battalion, PIB, that was a reconnaissance unit of around 30 officers and 280 soldiers. Those units would be the first to contact Japanese troops on the 23rd of July in the Kokoda attack campaign. A PIB platoon under Lieutenant John Chilk ambushed Japanese forces as they were relaxing. The 40-man platoon engaged from a hill overlooking the Gona-Sangara Road, killing several before being forced to retreat under small arms fire and mortar rounds. However, in the confusion, some soldiers of the PIB deserted. The platoon connected with 11th Platoon of B Company and, on the following day, harassed Japanese troops as they tried to cross the Kumusi River, as the bridge near Wairopi was destroyed by the Australians. Again, after Japanese machine gun and mortar rounds, some Papuan soldiers deserted by escaping in the jungle. However, the Allied forces, while effective in these ambushes, were being beaten back again and again. On the 25th, the Allied units clashed with the Japanese at Gorari. The Australian and Papuans retreated to Oivi. Because the nearest unit, C Company of the 39th Battalion, was at Yolo, Lieutenant Colonel William Owen requested units to be flown in. Hoping to halt the advance, the Allies dug in on the night between the 26th and the 27th, but were driven back by superior Japanese forces. Captain Sam Templeton was captured and executed, and Lieutenant Colonel Owen took command. The Battle of Kokoda was about to start. The Australians and Papuans, numbering around 130-148, were positioned south of Kokoda at the Niki. An advanced unit informed them that the Japanese were, contrary to what was believed, not yet in town. In fact, the Japs were still pursuing the survivors from Oivi. Some of the Allied survivors, part of B Company, PIB, administrative unit, and some signal unit from the 30th Brigade HQ, the unit that was by organization above the 39th Battalion, met C Company that was advancing. This company, led by Lieutenant Colonel Owen, had the objective to slow the enemy advance and hold as much as possible the strategic high-step of Kokoda. This is to understand why this was a hard task, both because of the broken front line and because of the very small defense that a single company can offer against an entire regiment. The Japanese were advancing quickly with a forward detachment of around 200 men under Captain Tetsuo Ogawa. These troops, who most were already experienced having fought in China, flanked the Allied troops that were positioned in a horseshoe formation. On the afternoon of the 28th, two Allied cargo planes arrived carrying reinforcement from 49th Infantry Battalion, but were not able to land as the airstrip were occupied by some barricades, and the Australian troops were slow in removing them. Considering that those planes were probably C-47 Dakota, and that each could carry at most 28 soldiers, had they landed, they could have made a little difference in the fight. However, this was not the case, and the troops on the ground were left alone. Obviously not by Japanese soldiers, as Ogawa's troops started harassing them when night fell, before launching a frontal assault up the slopes, supported by light mortars and an artillery piece. I was not able to find exact information about this gun. It could have been a 70mm Type 92 battalion gun, as this small howitzer was present apparently in all battalions. Or it could have been the 75 mountain artillery that I've indicated earlier, the one that only had 200 rounds carried by soldiers in backpacks. Anyways, what's important to note is that the Allied had no ways of answering to the artillery that began to inflict casualties between the defenders. The Australians could only defend themselves with small arms fire and by rolling grenades down the slope. The Japanese closed in and started close-quarter combat, sometimes even hand-to-hand, as they reached the enemy defensive position. At 3 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel William Owen was mortally wounded in the head while he was in a frontline weapon pit. Taken to a nearby hut that was being used as a medical post, Captain Geoffrey Doc Vernon saw that there was nothing he could do to save him, and because the Australians were retreating and Owen could not be moved, he was cleaned up and left in a comfortable position. Allied troops under Major William Watson retreated back to the Niki, arriving there at sunrise. The Australians suffered 7 killed and 6 wounded, while the Japanese suffered 12 killed and 26 wounded. One of the Japanese killed in action was the commander of this small force, Captain Tetsuo Ogawa, who was killed near the end of the fight. The Australians, while routing, left behind everything that they could not carry, including a large amount of grenades, 5 machine guns, and more than 1,800 rounds of rifle ammunition. But the Aussies were not done yet, and they wanted to recapture their lost ground, and on the 8th of August they moved forward. Both sides received much needed reinforcement in this 10 days pause. The Australians, who sent back the remaining soldiers of B Company, had 39th Battalion under ground command of Major Alan Cameron, who was 30th Brigade commander. Against their 430-strong complement, the Japanese had reinforced their troops with the arrival of the other companies of the 1st Battalion, 144th Infantry Regiment, numbering 660 soldiers, who started marching towards the Niki. In the following encounter battle, Australian Sea Company under Captain Arthur Dan was pushed back to the Nikki, and the commander was killed in action. This put the battalion headquarters at risk, and Major Cameron had to hastily organize a defense, which had to fight for several hours against the enemies. The other companies were more lucky. D Company took Pirivi, east of Iowa Creek, thus endangering the Japanese rear, while A Company was able to capture Kokoda almost undefended. Here they found the body of Lieutenant Colonel Owen and buried him. He would later be reburied at Bomara, northwest of Port Moresby. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and was mentioned in dispatches. The Japanese were caught off guard at first, but quickly regained their composure and started counterattacking. The company was pushed back from Pirivi by 2 groups of Japanese engineers, while A Company was under fire while in Kokoda. The unit, under Captain Noel Symington, tried to notify their friendly forces with a red flare and by dispatching messengers in order to ask for reinforcement and supplies. The company hoped of being supplied by air, as they held even when Japanese pressure increased. However, in mid-morning on the 10th, the expected plane passed over them without landing. Understanding that further resistance was futile, the captain ordered a withdrawal west of Kokoda around 7 p.m. as ammunition and food were running low. Both D and A Company reached friendly lines by escaping to the jungle. Japanese forces suffered 21 killed and 44 wounded, while the Australians suffered 23 killed and 17 wounded. A Company was withdrew to Iora village and was replaced by the inexperienced E Company, formed by the Battalion Machine Gun Company. Due to communication delays, the plane that was meant to supply Symington's company arrived the day after and dropped the supplies on the Japanese, who were starting to feel the logistical problems of the campaign. Several hours later, however, news of the capture of the town reached Allied High Command that sent planes to bomb the village. While unsuccessful, the Australian attack managed to delay the Japanese advance. The Emperor troops estimated the Australians of being around 1,000 strong, therefore decided to stop the advance to reinforce their position. This bought the Aussies vital time to reinforce and reorganize before the next attack. The loss of the airstrip meant that the Australians could not fly in troops that could have helped halting the Japanese. They, however, were not able to reinforce by air the 1st Battalion because of the heavy airplane losses that the Japanese suffered at Guadalcanal. Nevertheless, they will still continue to aim south, towards Port Moresby. Next time, we will see a further development of the Kokoda attack campaign. As always, sources are in the description. Thank you for watching, and remember to always tell HQ if you retreat from a village.